Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm delighted that in spite of the many distractions and pressures created by the CSW, we have a full house this afternoon. And I would like to interpret that to mean that there is real interest in the two subjects that we are taking up in the public consultations this afternoon. And these two subjects are the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the subject of the relationship between the UN and regional organizations, civil society, the private sector, and NGOs. This is the fourth in a series of public consultations that we are holding. Now, who are we? We are an independent commission which has been established pursuant to discussions between the Secretary General of the United Nations and the President of the IPI, Terry Rod Larson, with the specific purpose of ascertaining whether the United Nations, on the occasion of its 70th anniversary, is fit for purpose. And we are looking at the functioning of the multilateral system anchored in the UN through 16 areas, which we describe, for want of a better term, as ICM issue areas. And I'm pleased to inform you that this process, which started in February 2015, is now almost nearing completion. In fact, in a few days, next week, in particular on the 22nd and 23rd, we will be having the last of our retreats, the 16th, which will deal with armed conflict, mediation, conciliation, and peacekeeping. For those of you who are new to our working methods and procedures, we typically follow the following food chain. We get somebody to write an issues paper which lists the main issues in a particular subject, and there are 16 subjects there. After that issues paper has been written, we convene a retreat. The retreat should ideally consist of 25 people, some ambassadors, some members of civil society, members of the UN Secretariat, academics, for a day and a half of interactive discussion of that issue paper. Based on the feedback that we get from the retreat, we convert the issue paper into a discussion paper. The discussion paper then goes on to the website. And once that is done, we come to the final, in a sequential staging of our work, is we have a public consultation. Today is the fourth public consultation, and it is on two of our discussion papers, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change, and the relationship between the UN and regional organizations, civil society, the private sector, and NGOs. It is critical from our point of view that this public consultation provide an opportunity to members of civil society, academics, and others present here and who will participate through live streaming and through social media, to give us their feedback on how they view the evolution and consideration of the subject. Now, these are all challenges which the multilateral system will face in the coming decades. This is a system whose architecture was conceived in the mid-40s. The architecture was then designed both to ensure that the world is never subjected to the devastation of another world war, and also to ensure that there is post-war reconstruction along with the other Bretton Woods institutions. Now, as an independent commission, we will take into account the views of the member states. Having served and represented a member state, I can tell you in all honesty, many of today's problems are in fact being created by member states and those who are running that state-centric model. There is also another part of the charter on which there's been latent tension, we the peoples. And frankly, bringing in civil society, the private sector, NGOs is crucial to any examination of how the multilateral system is functioning today and whether it is fit for purpose to face the challenges of tomorrow, which we have listed there. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here this afternoon in such good numbers. And as I said, in spite of the CSW, which is important, but clearly some of us have our prioritization right. Now, let me just give you a brief background in terms of, please don't quote me on that. Number one, the discussion paper on UN and partnerships was posted online on 3rd February. It has to date received 1,133 visits online. The discussion paper on the 2030 Agenda and Climate Change was posted online on February 22 and has received 659 visits. Now, I am going to take, for the purposes of our interaction this afternoon, those papers as having been seen, if not entirely read. And we want to concentrate today on getting critical feedback from you after we've had brief presentations by an excellent panel. I have with me on my extreme left my senior colleague, who's the director of research in the IPI and who's a very valuable member of the ICM team, Dr. Adam Lupel. He has been central to the ICM's functioning, and he will have a very important role to play in the final writing of our report. So if there's something that we are doing you don't like, today is the time to tell him. Then I have on my left my very dear friend Minthu Pham, who's Executive Director of Policy at the United Nations Foundation. Minthu has been a very active supporter of the ICM process. She has spared the time to attend many of our functions, including retreats, and we have drawn strength from her and the work that the UN Foundation does. Then on my right, we have Jimena, who is also a colleague of mine at the IPI. She has been doing much of the backstopping work and the paper writing on the 2030 Agenda and climate change. Prior to joining the IPI, she had a very distinguished career in the permanent mission of Guatemala, whose ambassador, my dear friend Gert Rosenthal, is also with us. I welcome you, sir. And then later in the discussion, we will be joined by Dr. David Nabarro, who is the Special Advisor of the UN Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change. Now, before I invite my distinguished panelists, colleagues on the panel to speak, I just thought I would focus your attention very briefly on what I think are the issues that we need to be discussing. And in doing so, I'm not trying to suggest that you confine yourself to those issues. I'm merely offering a set of suggestions, very briefly. Should you wish to go into any other areas of 2030 Agenda, climate change, I mean, I can think of quite a few myself. Please feel free to do that when we come to the discussions part of our, when we throw the discussions open. First and foremost, amongst the three issues that I have outlined are, as the multilateral system transforms, how should the United Nations adapt to take better advantage of partnerships with regional organizations, civil society, NGOs, and the private sector? And we have decided, for good reason, to deal with these two discussion papers together because we believe the 2030 Agenda and climate change at the end of the day will succeed if we are able to get the right partnerships. Because I think that the transformative nature of the 2030 Agenda is not realizable, if there is any such word, unless the civil society, private sector, member states, the financial institutions all put their hearts and souls and their minds, of course, into achieving that objective. Now, those 3 issues which I wanted, or 4, are actually on the board there. The second one is, how should the multilateral system and the UN in particular best frame its approach to the 2030 agenda for SDGs and climate change? Third, in light of the analysis put forth in both papers, what is your reaction to the policy recommendations which are there or suggested in those papers, if any, and would you like to suggest any other recommendations? And finally, any other views, observations, or questions that should be addressed with regard to both papers? One final comment before I invite my colleagues on the dais here to open the discussion. You know, having been around in this system for nearly 4 decades, in and around the multilateral system, there are good years and there are not so good years. 2015 was a good year because we were able to adopt the 2030 agenda and also reach agreement on climate change in Paris. Now, you might say, what's so special about that? Well, something is very special about that. Not all UN processes which the multilateral system has supported have finally concluded with positive results. In fact, what distinguishes the SDGs from their predecessor, the MDGs, was that the MDGs had intellectual work on them done outside in the OECD. In the case of the SDGs, this was a bottoms-up negotiating process in which all 193 member states participated, which has resulted in a tremendous buy-in by the stakeholders who are the member states. Now, by itself, that's not going to ensure success because the member states have reached a good outcome. What could happen is that there may be a situation where the resources are not forthcoming. Those are the kind of questions you might wish to put to the panel, and especially Dr. Nabarro when he's here. The second, climate change. I have a slightly cynical view, even whilst I was rejoicing in the conclusion of that agreement. And that cynical view stems from the fact that it looks very good on paper, but if you analyze the agreement, somewhere you come to the conclusion that a lot is left to the goodwill of individual states, and that the legally binding lock-in is perhaps left to the goodwill of states. And if states don't follow the the aspirational high benchmarks which are in the agreement, we might have problems as we go along. But those are 2 comments. Now I invite my dear friend and colleague Adam to open the discussion on these, on an overview of these 2 papers. And of course, each of the presenters should feel free to pick and focus on any particular aspect. And maybe 5-6 minutes each. Adam, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Hardeep. There's a lot to already to get us going there in your opening. I'm going to focus on the paper on the relationship between the UN and regional organizations, civil society, NGOs, and the private sector. Of course, the UN, the question of the relationship between the UN and its partners is, of course, not a new one. As we know, a recognition of the relationship between the UN and regional arrangements dates back to the UN Charter in Chapter 8 and for NGOs in Article 71. But the international sphere is more crowded and complex than ever before. At last count, 33 regional economic organizations have been founded just since 1989. By some counts, there are over 40,000 international NGOs working today. The UN is nearly everywhere, which is both a strength and a liability, but it is never the only actor at play in any given context. And this means it must improve its ability to effectively partner, something that has been recognized repeatedly in the last year in the formal review processes and, of course, in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Achieving the core goals of the multilateral system requires working through networks of member states, regional arrangements, international organizations, private sector actors, and civil society. The most effective international organizations will be those that best take advantage of this reality and position themselves to coordinate, convene, facilitate, and inspire such networks. As a universal organization with 193 member states, charter ties to regional arrangements, a long tradition of engaging civil society, and an emerging interest in architecture in promoting the positive power of the private sector, the UN is quite well placed to continue to do just that, to take advantage of this reality. The challenge will be to develop a strategic vision to recognize the transformation in the international sphere in order to best fulfill the UN's comparative advantages and to align policies and practices to truly make the organization fit to respond to the challenges of the 21st century. So I want to just focus on a few of the recommendations in the paper in the interest of getting your responses. And again, this is, as Hardeep said, this is very much, we call this a public consultation because we really are really committed to consulting. And we really are looking for your responses, both here today, but also online and through email. Feel free to get in touch with me. This is a collective project. Thus, our first recommendation in relation to this question of a need for a strategic vision is, early in her first term, the next Secretary General should produce a strategic vision document defining the UN's commitment to partnership at all levels, especially in relation to civil society, NGOs, the private sector, and of course, regional organizations. Regional organizations play an increasingly important role in the multilateral system. I think this is widely recognized, and it's something that has come up again and again in the ICM retreats. As Hardeep mentioned, we're having our 16th and final one next week, and it's something, regional organizations is a topic that has come up again and again throughout the process. There are many challenges related to regional organizations, and we must recognize that they can't do everything. But in the future, it will be important to further develop and improve frameworks for coordination and cooperation. As we have several draft recommendations in the report on regional organizations, let me just highlight briefly two of them. First, on Chapter 8. In comparison to Chapter 7, Chapter 8 has received relatively little attention. And so we recommend the convening of an expert-level conference on Chapter 8 to better understand how it has been interpreted in the past and how it can be better utilized for the improved maintenance of international peace and security. For example, better understandings could be had of the following, among other things. What delimits regional action, as referred to in Article 52.1? What specific activities may a regional organization carry out under Articles 52, 2, and 4, and Article 53? What is required for regional organizations to fulfill the duty to keep the Security Council fully informed of activities in contemplation for the maintenance of international peace and security? Clarity on these matters of mutual obligation under the Charter would be helpful. Of course, when discussing peace and security in regional organizations, the African Union looms large. And much of the focus on AU-UN partnerships has been on peacekeeping, and rightly so, for obvious reasons. The Hippo report has an extended discussion on this. But in the paper, we recommend looking at tools in addition and beyond peacekeeping. The AU Peace and Security Architecture and the AU Governance Architecture contain such tools, and the paper recommends that these should be explored. Quickly on civil society and NGOs. It's been 20 years since the approval of ECOSOC Resolution 1996-31, and we argue that it's time to revisit it and modernize it. So we recommend a general review of the arrangements for consultation with NGOs should be convened with a view to updating ECOSOC Resolution 1996-31, among other things. As I'm sure many of you know, the 2016 ECOSOC Forum on Partnerships will be held on March 31st, and this is on partnerships and the SDGs. So as Hardeep mentioned, we see these two issues very intimately related. Jimena will talk more on this, but I'll say two quick recommendations that we have in the paper on this. We recommend that the concrete practice of inclusion must be carried through to the follow-up and review of the 2030 agenda in the high-level political forum. And finally, the private sector must continue to be engaged for the successful implementation of the SDGs. We see this as critical. And a good starting point, we think, would be to further develop the SDG funds, private sector advisory group framework for action. As the Secretary General said in November, the 2030 agenda calls on us to move from silos to synergy and from fragmentation to partnership. And we hope that this process will help make that move a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's as clear an exposition as one can get. Move away from Chapter 7 more into Chapter 8. Go for, conciliation, mediation, or anything that looks like that. More effective consultation with civil society, revisit the original mandate. So I think, I hope with a gathering like this that resonates well. But I think it resonates well everywhere, because I think we are seeing the problems of not doing that manifest themselves in many of the crisis areas we find ourselves. But thank you very much, Adam. Now, my friend Mintu, you have the floor.
Great, thank you.
And please feel free to comment on both the papers, one paper, any other paper that you think we should be hearing your comments on. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ambassador Puri, and really, thank you so much for leading such a intense and consultative process. Really great intellectual stimulation for those of us who've been around the UN for a long time, thinking about these issues, and the great fresh thinking that you've already brought in, and the ideas that you've brought in has been really great. I work with the UN Foundation, which many of you may know is an organization that tries to help to connect the UN to people, resources, and ideas. And in that, over the last few years, we've been working on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the Financing for Development agenda as one of the crowning achievements for the UN. And I think we saw that last year, both with the SDGs and the climate agreement. The UN Foundation has worked hard to try to bring diplomats, civil society, private sector together to help us get the most meaningful and bold outcome that we could. And I think we saw that last year. And so in the spirit of that, I thought I'd provide some reflections on that, as well as the role of partnerships, civil society, and the private sector, and in particular on the SDGs. I think last year we saw three main things coming out, or themes that we can't ignore. First is this idea of integration, that no longer can we think of development and climate and environmental issues as separate, and that these are absolutely part and parcel. And so when we talk about the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, as well as the climate agenda, I think it's very well suited that you on this forum are discussing those together. We know that those two issues absolutely have to be interlinked now. And not only that, but the SDGs agenda itself is a very cross-cutting, interlinked agenda. And while we have 17 goals, they are not in and of themselves siloed. I think many people, including Jimena here and others, have looked at how we examine a networked approach to the goals. So the SDGs themselves, even if you look at one issue area, touch on other targets within other goals. And so it is an integrated agenda, which creates many opportunities, but it also creates some challenges, and I'll get into that in a second, while trying to be as quick as I can. Secondly, big theme coming out of last year was leave no one behind and inequality. We thought this was an incredibly powerful and important idea. It was one of the gaps in the MDGs. We know that we were able to achieve many of the MDGs because of economic growth and because of the focus on results and a time frame that was bound. But we know that we left many behind. And so this time around, we absolutely have to get to the most vulnerable. And that includes looking at inequality within a country, within populations, as well as across countries. And so that, again, also creates some challenges as well as opportunities. And then lastly, I think a major theme coming out of last year is that We are in a universe where everyone has to be at the table, that we are no longer talking about this just being a government agenda or an agenda that is owned by a few or an agenda that is owned by a certain set of countries, but that this really has to bring everyone to the table. Civil society, citizens, private sector, developing countries, developed countries. It's a universal agenda. It's a major theme, and I think we're not going to be able to revert back to the way that things were. So on that point, let me just first touch on some of the points that Adam raised and that were raised in this great paper on partnerships. We know that civil society's role within the SDGs was absolutely critical. And in fact, one of the lessons that the UN Foundation learned, and I think many of us learned in this very inclusive process, is that when outside stakeholders, civil society, the private sector, and others, experts, academia, research institutions, when they are connected to the process, they are much more forgiving and accepting of the outcome at the end of the day. And that has an immense impact on ownership. Why is this important? When you looked at the SDGs, the civil society participation, private sector participation helped to shape what the agenda looked like. It helped us to look at a networked approach, an integrated approach. They raised issues that maybe governments or diplomats sitting in New York, as talented as many of you are, may not have considered. And it really helped to lend credibility to the process at the end of the day. And what this does is create a sense of ownership that's going to be absolutely needed in this next period for citizens to understand what this process is. We know that governments can't do it alone. They know that we need all actors to help raise awareness of what the SDGs are, as well as to help implement this agenda. Absolutely critical. The other thing is that this engagement helped to make sure that the SDGs were more accepted. So I think many civil society groups would say, well, it's just a matter of course that gender equality or issues around sexual and reproductive health should be part of this agenda, or that looking at inclusive and peaceful societies should be part of this. And yet, when you go and negotiate with 193 countries, those are not obvious issues. And so when civil society and others start to understand the nuances and the perspectives, I think they then begin to understand why this was such a hard-fought process and why at the end of the day this really is something that we can be proud of. So I think there is one concern, though, in terms of civil society, actually several, but most importantly, I think we know that because it was so beneficial for civil society and the private sector to have a seat at the table, we know we can't go back now. And as I said, in terms of implementation, in terms of follow-up and review, accountability of this process, we need all actors at the table. And so I really would just have us think very thoughtfully about how we continue to engage. And two suggestions in particular on that front. One is civil society absolutely has to have more advance notice. Within civil society, there are lots of questions around, well, who represents civil society? Are they just northern-based groups that sit in the back of the conference rooms who are based in New York and are lucky enough to be here to speak up? Or are they representing grassroots organizations, organizations that are based in the South, community-based organizations and others? And civil society needs to know in advance so that they can get visas, so that they can get funding, so that they can rally one another around and understand what their views are to be able to be better represented in the global processes and decision-making processes. At the national level, there is closing civil society space. I think we've seen that time and again. Local and national civil society actors absolutely have to have support from those outside. Sometimes they can't quite say certain things within a government. You can understand that certain societies are more closed than others. And so I think it's imperative on those of us who care about this agenda to find ways to support those views, including providing external views. On partnerships in the private sector, I mean, this has been a contentious issue in the UN for a long time. In the universe of the SDGs, as I said, all actors absolutely have to be at the table, and there is no way we're going to be able to do this on our own. There are many who say that a lot of the fault is on member states for maybe shirking their duties and looking only at private finance and other types of ways, alternative ways to help finance and bring actors to the UN. Of course, those things need to be fixed. But at the same time, I think we also have to, we know that we're not going to get this done. And in the universe of having everyone who needs to be at the table. We really do need to get partnerships right. And that means focusing on beneficiaries. That means finding ways to integrate and bring everyone else to the table. I have other comments, but I realize my time is out, so maybe I'll save this for later. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for all that you said, all your comments. But I liked one in particular. How do you ensure that civil society and private sector have a seat on the table? Because you can't achieve that objective without them. And if you want to leave them outside the process, then you've got a bigger problem on your hands. And, I want to take this, in fact, point from slightly away from this 2030 agenda and climate change, etc., to a larger point. My own feeling, and this is something which the ICM exercise is bearing out, is that as we get into the nitty-gritty of these subjects, these 16 subjects, it's very clear, as Adam said, the UN is not the only actor. There are other actors. In the case of the health sector, for instance, the WHO's budget does not compare with the Gates Foundation's budget. I mean, they are much more. Medicine Sans Frontier, other people are there on the ground. Now, I don't know how you characterize them. I would characterize them as non-UN, civil society, part business, foundations, and so on, like yourselves. The problem that is arising here is many people want to act and participate and contribute, but they are using the 2030 agenda merely to generate resources for their own activities. Somebody has to assume responsibility for delivering on the totality. And I agree with you, unless they are part of the decision-making and sitting on the table, this ain't going to happen. But so I'm sure people will come back here and comment on whether that's a right view or not a right view. There are people in delegations who turn around and say all the time, oh, this is a state-centric model. This is about member states. Sure, member states can do it if they want to, but can the member states deliver? I personally don't think so. But thank you. Jimena, you want to stir things up now as the provocateur, whatever the expression is, it's yours now.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to IPI colleagues. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here. And as Ambassador Puri said, not even the most cynical among us thought that 2015 was going to be such an amazing year, and that idealistic of us never thought that these two agreements would come with genuine standing ovations at the end. So it is true that 2015 broke many of the expectations of the UN and how the UN can actually deliver in the multilateral track. The paper in front is a draft, and it tries to connect the dots between the climate change world, the 2030 universe, as Mintu put it, and also attempts to link it with peace and security. Having said that, this is still very much a draft because many updates will have to be included. Moreover, as you know, NASA just announced that February was the warmest month in record. So we will have to be, saying that warming is happening at a much faster rate than what we anticipated. It is an exciting time to see how these documents can be transformed into concrete projects and outlines. And I see familiar colleagues here that helped in the creation of this agenda: Brazil at the end, Norway, Netherlands, UK, Greece. So it's good to have all these people here. And the question right now is how will these visions transform into concrete actions? And one of the key questions is, how do we transcend the silos? For us in the ICM, one of the key elements that has been like a resonating theme across the 16 issue areas is leadership. Leadership to transform the system so that it can be at par with the challenges of implementing such a broad canvas. We don't believe that we need to create new structures, but rather to change the relationship between GA, ECOSOC, HLPF, the new FFD forum, the PVC, the TFM. There's all these new components in the architecture, and just the question really is, how are we going to make this work? And how are we going to make the 2030 agenda work with the INDCs in the climate change world? So the challenge is really big, but when we go back and we go back to 2010 and 2011, the SDGs were considered a crazy idea. No one thought at that time that they would replace or not replace, but they would be the follow-up of the MDGs. This same type of creative thinking and leadership is needed so that the UN structures are renewed and updated. So we need to carry that kind of spirit of cooperation into the conversations today. Also, when we speak about private sector, there's so much tension on private sector engagement, and we believe that it's time, for example, the PGA to come up with a process so that member states feel more comfortable engaging private sector. Currently, there is no strategy on how we engage the private sector, but the PGA could perhaps open a process in which we elaborate guidelines led by member state on what are the principles that should guide private sector investments in the 2030 agenda particularly. If we need trillions of dollars, as the World Bank have said, we cannot do it without the private sector, yet we don't know how to engage with them. So kind of resolving that conundrum would be really important, and member states will have to show leadership on that. We also believe that leadership by the new Secretary General, her or him, whomever may be, placing this issue as a key priority in his executive offices and above it in the CEB will be very important so that the whole system aligns itself. And I see here walking the Dr. Navarro as I speak on leadership of the UN, so it's perfect timing. And also, another key aspect is how do we link the climate change world and the poverty in the 2030? Hi. No problem. Welcome. So aside from leadership, another key component is how are we going to meet one of the key objectives in the 2030 agenda, which is eradicating poverty in all its forms. This is also another key component that connects with the climate change world, because if we don't act on climate change, the ones that are going to bear the worst brunt are the poor, and we also might risk to reverse all the gains made to eradicate poverty by 2030. So climate change is also extremely linked with the 2030 agenda via its core mandate, which is to eradicate poverty. And so what can we do in 2016 now that these outcomes will be adopted, aside from linking these two outcomes, thinking of the INDCs together with the Paris Agreement? We believe that these two outcomes are a good follow-up of the Charter, because they have really brought the UN back to the spotlight, and they have really the capacity to realign priorities at all levels, from the UN to regional organizations, to member states, and the essential ingredient to transform this vision into action will be leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimena. You said that the 2030 agenda and fulfilling that will require the UN to change its method of functioning, look at issues not through the silos of their own departmental prism, etc. And I was just tempted to say, and if you permit, I will say it, if the UN can achieve that, then with or without the 2030 agenda being fulfilled, I would welcome the UN adopting a new approach to solving problems. And I say this with the fact that I've been a supporter of the UN now for many decades. But let me take this occasion to welcome Dr. Navarro. I have known him for a long time, and I divide people in the UN system, as I've been telling some of my colleagues, those who get work done and those who create a lot of activity. He belongs to the group of people who get things done. And my first interaction, he may have forgotten, was when I was permanent representative of India in Geneva, and we were doing what is called a Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which was the first public health treaty we negotiated. And he was the, in many ways, the support, the brains, and so on. So, and then, of course, after that, he has gone on to do other things, Ebola crisis management, and so on. But all I can say is that when the Secretary General appointed him as what do you call it, a coordinating point for 2030 agenda, I said, well, we may have a fighting chance to actually get this one in also. But Dr. Navarro, welcome. And you just happened to arrive when the third of our panelists finished. So I will request you to make a brief presentation.
Thank you.
Share with us your optimism, your anxiety, whichever way you want to go first. And then we'll throw it open for an hours of interaction with our very distinguished audience. You have the floor.
It's always a very bad thing to do, to arrive in an event when most of the people have spoken, because there's a real risk that I will just simply duplicate what others have said. But let's imagine it's the other way around. Let's imagine that I say the complete opposite of what the others have said. Then it might get quite exciting. So whatever way, this is a really great place to be, and I'd like to really thank the colleagues in the IPI with whom I've been working on other issues recently for reaching out and inviting me to join this event. I'd like also to really acknowledge the expertise and contribution of the chair, who, as he said, I've worked with on a number of different issues, and other members of the panel. I'd like to describe the work that I've been asked to do by the Secretary General in relation to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I'd then like to give you my own feelings about this agenda and the potential that it has for influencing and indeed transforming not just the way in which the United Nations system works, but also the ways in which quite a lot of other institutions works. And then thirdly, I'd like to look with you on 2 or 3 issues that I think are absolutely key for making it happen. I appreciate that we want to keep time for discussion, and so I will be brief. As the chair said, I'd been doing a task which was to help ensure that the UN system came together and gave the right kind of leadership in relation to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. That was extremely challenging, and if you wish later, I'd be very happy to give you my own views on that in a capsule. I just was finishing that work off when the Secretary General contacted me and said, could I come and work with him really to replace Amina Mohammed, but she's irreplaceable, so I couldn't really replace her, but to take on the work that she had started in her role as Special Advisor on the post-2015 agenda. He said to me, please could you have a look and see how the different nations are taking this agenda forward? Could you also look at how the UN system is taking this agenda forward? And then could you look at how groups outside the UN, business, civil society, faith groups, academics, creative community, media and others, how they're taking this agenda forward? And could you give me regular updates on what is happening? Because he said, I want to use the last year of my time in office to give as strong as possible impulsion to this effort by world leaders to change the world. So, of course, he knew when he was offering me this set of responsibilities that I couldn't possibly do everything myself, and we both agreed that. So what I've set up to do is to work with others to access information about how this agenda is being tackled in different locations. I'll give you a very quick report. Governments all over are truly taking this agenda seriously. It transcends some of the usual bits of business that go on in a government, and it provides a much higher and significant set of not just goals, but also visionary endpoints for governments to seek to pursue. Governments are doing it in different ways, but we have more than 65 governments who in various ways have been in touch with the UN quite actively saying, we'd like to work with you all on finding ways to get the 2030 Agenda into national plans, and also to get our governments and our institutions and our wider community coming together around this agenda. It has caught the imagination of governments in a big way. They're also saying, we'd like you to help us on measurement and how we establish the right kind of measurement processes to see how we're getting on. And then they say, we'd like you to help us on looking at the linkages, both the conceptual linkages and the actual operational linkages across the 17. Secondly, within the UN system, I've met, either on my own or with the Secretary General, with the heads now of 18 out of the 65 entities within the UN system that we have to focus on. And the number is increasing at a fast rate. Some of them I've met with their senior management, some of them I've met with their governing boards. They are all recognizing that this is a completely different agenda for their work, and that they've got to change, and they've got to change without simply adding on an extra department called 2030 Agenda, that this has to now get infiltrated across all the business that they're doing, like a watermark, and that it has to be done in a way that doesn't necessarily have them going and asking for more cash. Of course, there are some that are saying, we've got a few extra jobs to do, like running a lot of intergovernmental processes, so we do need some extra resources. But by and large, with the Secretary General encouraging reprioritization of activities and use of existing resources, we are not seeing a kind of frenzy of people requiring more cash. But there is, of course, unfortunately, a spectre of extreme resource shortage, but that's because of other reasons, because of the decline in overseas development assistance from some countries. But the general line is, we're ready to let this be an overarching mandate that comes in over the top of our existing governance mechanisms. Many of our organizations have got governance bodies. The World Health Assembly governs the World Health Organization, and the International Labour Organization has its own governance. In fact, many of them do. But all of them are recognizing that this is now a different driver for what they've got to do. And then thirdly, as we talk to others, whether it's the Association of Mobile Telephone Operators, or associations of publishers, or associations or organizations responsible for business more generally, New Global Business Commission on Sustainable Development, each of these different groups that we talk to say, yes, we're ready not only to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals into our practices, but we're ready to see them as the political drivers for what we're trying to do. So in essence, what we've got is a political manifesto for the world that is the political manifesto for nations, for the United Nations, and for the wider community of concerned entities. And because it's a political manifesto, there's no case of people saying, well, we can't do it because it's technically not possible. They say, as has happened in the Statistical Commission last week, we will find ways to adapt our ways of doing business so that we can deliver on this political manifesto. This is hugely important. And in my professional life, I've not seen it before. So if we start from that, then let's just think a bit about what that political manifesto represents. And this is the second part of my remarks. It's universal, which means it applies to every nation, which means that we no longer can comfortably talk about developing nations and developed nations. Instead, we say all nations are developing. Secondly, it is absolutely essential. There is no plan B. This is the plan for the survival of our species and the gradual emergence of our species into a world that's fair and just. Plus, it's the plan for the health of our planet and for restoring the natural resources in earth, in water, in the atmosphere, that will enable our planet to support life and livelihoods for generations to come. There's no plan B, I keep saying it, i.e. it's absolutely essential that this plan is realised in the spirit that the leaders have brought it forth. And included in that manifesto and plan is a big focus on peace, Goal 16, the institutions and activities that are necessary for resolving conflicts without violence and for preventing violent extremism as a way in which people gain territory or gain power. And that is key to advancing forward, and it's really significant that the peace element is in there. It's also a document and an agreement that represents a new social contract between rights holders and duty bearers. It is a human rights document. It's indivisible because you actually cannot, according to those who negotiated it, take one goal out and say we're going to hit that goal, and you certainly can't take one target out and say we're just going to work on that target. You have to take responsibility for the full tapestry of the 17. And that means it requires integrated and joined up thinking and action. And that's where it gets really difficult, because all of us have been brought up in our schools and in our universities, in our professional lives and in government, to see the world in terms of sectors and disciplines. If we're going to take this seriously, which we have to because we're politically required to do so, we've got to undo that thinking and see horizontal working, attending to interfaces, being people-centered in empowering people to do work in this way is the key. And that means that we have to tame our instincts to become specialists in one or other subsector, and we have to control our institutions, which are extremely focused and siloed. It creates massive challenges within the UN, where you've got governance bodies that are saying focus, 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 and yet at the same time the SDG approach says be horizontal, look at the interfaces and make certain that you don't get too rigid. But it gets even more complicated because inside this new agenda is the commitment to leave no one behind. And that means going under the average, going to the 10% in the lowest decile, going to the poorest, going to the invisible, going to the disabled. A big, big issue in the context of the CSW right now, a big issue in the context of the forthcoming World Humanitarian Summit. So here we have it, a political manifesto that's requiring us to work differently, think differently, and do differently. How on earth are we going to cope with it? And that's where the challenge that you were just talking about as I walked in becomes really, really interesting. My last point. How do we take an international bureaucracy shaped by the member states over the years, one that's got some processes that I think all of you believe to be quite rigidified, like a sort of Rubik's Cube. If you try to change the pattern, then you find you have to undo the whole thing. How do we take this and help it to reshape? As the Deputy Secretary General, who's ex-naval officer, is commonly heard to say, we've got to turn this battleship, and we've got to turn it quickly, and we've got to turn it with very weak motors to drive it, because we're not imbued with lots of spare cash, and we're not imbued with lots of people to spare to sit and think about the future. So how's it going to happen? Answer. Very interestingly, because the agenda is owned by the member states, the change process is being owned by the member states. All of you who've been participating in processes in New York recently will have noticed the very high degree of activity that's going on in retreats and in processes in ECOSOC or in the General Assembly to be rethinking the ways of working and being of the United Nations. My own responsibility, and I've not been immune from this, I've been given a big responsibility in the last 4 weeks to look at how the Secretariat works, set strategic priorities, identifies where it's going to concentrate, works out what it's going to focus on in terms of changing the way it functions. And so what are my take-homes? Number one, we will have to continue to move away from implementing projects to working with our partner countries on policy issues, on policy and its implementation, on working practices necessary for new policies, and on our own way of supporting that. So we've got to get into policy. Number two, we're going to have to take our institutions and find ways to build much more powerful horizontal thinking and action and reporting. And that will cause pain, and it will also require us to challenge the governing bodies of the separate institutions to find ways to work together. Last point, we'll have to do this without losing what's good. You know, there are elements of the UN's work that are absolutely priceless. The normative work, the specialized agencies that set the norms and standards, that without that, the world would be a very different place. The peacekeeping work, and making sure that that peacekeeping work is strong enough to cope with all the different buffeting that it gets and is adequately budgeted. And also, third strength, the human rights work, the real emergence that we've had of a much stronger human rights mechanism through the Human Rights Council. How can we make sure that those things that are working well, and there are many more, suitably integrated into the change? Well, that is going to be a big challenge. Postscript. We're Secretary General, just with him just now, was saying he's in his last 10 months now, but he's going to work until December the 31st, 2016, because he's got a lot to do. But we're also talking and thinking about the handover. It is a relay race. We've got the baton ready. When she comes, presumably it will be her. We always, because always when you're using a neutral pronoun, you tend to use he. Well, why shouldn't we use she for a change? I think it's a CSW week. So therefore, when the baton is handed over, and when she comes, we've got to make sure that that all this, if she wants, can be taken on in a good way and doesn't suddenly get dropped. And that's going to be, again, what all of you, as witnesses to this process, I believe will have a hugely important role. Because there's such a lot of important stuff happening, and it's necessary to make sure that that important stuff can be carried through, whilst at the same time, the necessary space is given for new leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Navarro. We'll have an opportunity to express our appreciation. No, I'm truly struck by the positive and determined characterization of your remarks. I mean, you say that member states that have been in touch with the UN, you mentioned 65 of them, have in fact displayed their determination. Slight footnote, there are 193 member states, so we need to work on the other 130 as well. Insofar as the Secretariat is concerned, that it is determined to look at what you call the ways of working, looking at horizontal integration, etc. That again is reassuring. It is a political manifesto by any yardstick. It is a new social contract, absolutely so. Outside these walls and the UN, which is just across the road, when I attend meetings in other places, they say that the kind of resources that will be required will not be in the millions or billions, but you require trillions to get the kind of transformation that this kind of an agenda's implementation will require. So I think that's the challenge, a great achievement and a reaffirmation that when you conduct comprehensive bottoms-up negotiations with all member states involved, you probably get a better result. Now I'm going to throw the floor open. I already see one request. Normal procedure here. Please identify yourself. Quick question, comment, and we will take 5 or 6 at a time. I have gentlemen here, then 2, then 3, John 4, and then 5. Yeah. Please identify. I know who you are, but still.
Yes, thank you. I'm Massimo Tommasoli, the Permanent Observer for International IDEA to the UN. I think that to answer your first question, Ambassador Puri, how should the UN adapt? I think that the key dimension that links the two reports is the need to learn, and to learn from the partners. That is an aspect that could be strengthened in this conversation. Let me make just two quick examples. For example, the last speaker spoke about the normative plus, the plus of the normative work of the UN. But regional organizations, despite some limitations, have also strengths in terms of normative work at the regional level. And in the field that I work in, which is democracy, elections, there are various examples of very strong and interesting normative frameworks, like the Inter-American Charter on Democracy or the African Charter on Democracy and Elections. So that is an area where there is a possibility to learn from regional organizations, which has to be founded on moving away from an exclusive focus in that partnership on peace and security. Important as it may be, there are other aspects of UN work where cooperation and partnership can actually benefit from this. Second comment is on the democratic accountability in public service delivery. Even in that, which serves the objectives of the 2030 agenda, regional actors are probably more equipped in terms of standards on democratic accountability in service delivery. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, I'm glad to hear what you said, because that actually validates our decision to have a discussion on both papers together. Because I think no one in his or her right mind, start with the her, will suggest that sitting in New York, the Secretariat or the 193 member states here can work out a blueprint for implementation. As I said, as Adam said initially, the UN is not omnipresent. There are other actors more. Secondly, regional organizations have a much better feel of the pulse. So on both the issues you mentioned, it's absolutely essential for the regional organizations to get involved. And so you have to turn the battleship around, as he said, the Deputy Secretary General said. And I think the Deputy Secretary General will get he said about weak motors. The Deputy Secretary General always draws inspiration from the Charter as giving power to those motors. So I will come back. Next, the gentleman here.
Andrew Tomlinson from the Quaker United Nations office, and thank you so much for your discussion today. On this question of integration, which I think is a key one, we do have a number of hints. One of them is the set of issues which might more broadly be described under the heading of resilience, which has to do with building both more and accompanying the building of both more robust communities in the face of local stress, but also of the global community in the face of these large global challenges. And this is where what we have in the 2030 agenda, and particularly the hints we have in the peaceful, just and inclusive societies, thread within that as a way to not only be thinking about all of these issues from the local to the global, but also actually very concretely implementing them. So there's two particular things I wanted to draw from your points and just put perhaps a keener edge on. One of them is to do with the role of member states. Now, in this profusion of actors that everyone is wanting to partner with and one with another, which is a wonderful thing, I think it's important we do not lose sight of the fact that states also are different actors. They have particular obligations and responsibilities. And I think it's important we don't lose sight of that. And so I'm curious on the insights of the panel on how, as we move forward into 21st century challenges, we can not only reshape the organizations, but also perhaps normatively some of the issues around the role of the member states.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm going to invite the panel, each one of them, to respond to the comments. John, can I request you to, yes, my colleague John Hirsch, and then the gentleman here. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you all very, very much. And it's wonderful to see Dr. Nabarro here again. I saw you in the car just a few months ago along with Adam here. And every one of you is really inspirational and tremendously committed, and it's very impressive. I have two questions. One is, so there's 16 or 17 goals. So my first question is about priorities. In other words, is it feasible to have 17 goals? I sort of remember always President Alpha Omar Konaré, who was the chairperson of the African Union for 5 years, and he started out with 17 goals or some such. And essentially he was unable to achieve any of them because he was just too spread out and he was not sort of cohering. My second question, which is somewhat related, is we used to have one of these, how the world is changing things here with Francesco, whom you all remember, Mancini. And we had a PowerPoint, and it showed in the beginning in 1945 the UN at the top of a pyramid. So everything came to the UN. And then he went back to a new PowerPoint, and there was the UN first, and then there were like 100 organizations around it that we all know exist. So from that sort of vision, the question is whether the UN can bring these other 80 or 100 together. Because I certainly really salute what you talked about, David, about trying to get them all together. But, is that doable? There you go.
Thank you, John. The gentleman here, please. Yes.
Dirk Solomons, Columbia University. The paper talks about the partnership between civil society and the UN. I wonder if the Commission could reflect on that and maybe rethink it in terms of a deep, deep relationship of mutual interdependence. In two ways, the civil society depends on the UN, in terms of legitimacy and in terms of protection. For example, where would Human Rights Watch or Amnesty be without the Universal Declaration and all the human rights instruments? Where would labor unions be without the conventions on the ILO? Where would, for example, Natural Resources Defense Council be without Rio and everything that has been normatively developed after that? So I would argue that there is a strong level of interdependence and that without the UN as a normative legitimizing framework, the civil society would be nowhere. And the other dimension is the dimension of protection. UN, I think, is the only thing that stands in the way of odd regimes obliterating civil society, in particular the media. It's very encouraging, for example, to see how the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recently spoken out again in situations like Turkey, Iran, where the media are being swept aside. And if it weren't for the UN's watchful eyes, again, large parts of civil society would be trampled. So I think we should talk about deep, deep interdependence and just not partnership. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's normal, it's customarily said that UN is universal. Because it's universal, it's credible, and therefore it has a deep convening power. But I've always said that's an incomplete picture. The UN is credibility and unique convening power is deprived from exactly what you're saying. It has got the Universal Declaration. It has done the excellent normative work on which civil society can build. So you're absolutely right, but the panel will come back on this issue of deep interdependence. Yes, sir, and then I'm going to request the panel to quickly comment before we take the second round of questions.
Bill Pace with WFM and the Institute for Global Policy. Quickly on the regional organization issue, historically I think it's generally true that regional organizations were basically clubs for heads of state to ensure non-interference. So we haven't completely moved away from that model. And I think, in fact, where I see, and I haven't read the full paper, but a gap is that I would say just with the African Union, the role of the sub-regional organizations, I think, is absolutely essential. And I'm wondering, are you including sub-regional organizations as international organizations? Because the completion of political economic integration and hopefully democratization, I think, will be coming also from those sub-regional organizations. Secondly, I think to avoid the financial issue is, and perhaps in another sector of the ICM, you're dealing with it, but clearly the global financial or the international financial architecture and regulation is, I think, essential in achieving any progress in this 2015 to 30, including something like global financial transfer levies to support all levels and aspects and sectors of multilateralism. I was very pleased that the ICM papers now describe the 3 pillars of the UN up to date, so peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. I think that is a very important and compliment you. And lastly, you talk about the non-governmental organizations and a need to review the 1996-31 arrangements, et cetera. I hope you will consult with those who were participating in that. I think there's been one important advance that has gone very much under the radar, and that is the consultative arrangements were with ECOSOC, but with the Human Rights Council, whose 10th anniversary we celebrated yesterday, the General Assembly did agree to allow the practices of the Human Rights Commission to apply to that subsidiary body of the General Assembly and to further the consultative arrangements between civil society and the General Assembly, I think will be tremendously important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Before I invite the next one, 2 quick questions. I think Adam would happily answer that. But when we talk about regional organizations, clearly it's not for us to draw the line in Addis Ababa. You want the sub-regional organizations very much there, not only for Africa, elsewhere. But John, I hope you don't carry your Konare 17-goal experience into this very positive exercise. But this is just a side. You and I will have a drink on that. Yeah, but sure. I know that. I'm just having some fun. Yeah. You had 5 comments, questions. Now I'm going to invite the panel very briefly to comment on any one of these 5 questions, and then because you'll get a chance to wrap up later also. You want to start, Adam?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of great insights there. I mean, first, I think I'll start with John in this question of the transformation a bit of the multilateral sphere and the image of the UN at the center of a pyramid, which is clearly no longer the case. It's interesting because it is one thing that has come up. We're at the end of this stage in the process of looking at the 16 issue areas, and so I keep coming back to certain themes that we've seen all throughout the process. And one of the themes that we've been hearing is relates directly to this, and looking at the multilateral system and the need to reframe multilateralism away from an idea of a hierarchical system and towards a more network-based ecosystem kind of vision. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, member states remain the fundamental building blocks of the multilateral system. That's article or the chapter 1. But there are many other actors, and how those actors all relate is going to be fundamental to the system moving forward. And then I think Massimo and others talk about integration. This again is another big theme that we've been hearing over and over again, and it makes me think again. I'm very happy that we're having this discussion together with the SDGs because when we talk about the SDGs, and as Dr. Nabarro referenced them as indivisible and that they require integrated thinking, I think as we move forward, more and more we're looking at the ways in which the implementation stage of the SDGs provides a perfect opportunity to advance this. Of course, yes, there's a tension perhaps between this emerging consensus around this need for integrated thinking and then the reality of diversity of actors and diversity of interests and how those play out. But if the emerging consensus really is recognizing the problem and the need to have more integrated thinking, I think we're halfway there. There's more, but I can...
Yeah, thank you. No, we will get a chance to come back. Mintu?
Great, thank you so much. Great questions. Just on this one about 17 goals, whether they're feasible and how we prioritize. This has been a discussion, as many of you have known, over at least the last 2 years. I think at the end of the day, we know that in an integrated agenda, there are many things that we need to address. There have been people who've looked at the goals and seen how they link with other things. Now, if an organization or even a department, many governments have 17 departments, lo and behold, can look at not only that one area, for instance, health, but also a goal like health, but also how it connects to many other areas under other goals, I think is a way that you can help. If you yourself want to prioritize health, there's a way to do it in an integrated way. But I think the debate's over, can we do 17? Well, I mean, would we have asked the same question if it were 10? Would we have asked the same question if it were 21? So I think there are ways to address this. Secondly, Andrew's point about resilience and building this in, and I think we've talked a little bit about peace and security, and you address this in your report. We really have to look at this as a developmental approach to peace. This is not a peace and security agenda. There are parts of the UN that deal with that. We do need to, and I think Ambassador Rosenthal has talked extensively about this, we need to find a way to integrate it. But the SDGs provides us a framework for enhancing the essential conditions of peace. And so we really should look at it in that way. How do you support institutions? How do you build in social inclusion and resilience, as Andrew said? Thirdly, just want to mention this role, address this issue of the role of member states. I couldn't agree with you more. Member states there is a mutual interdependence. Member states set norms and set visions or agendas like the 2030 agenda. And so in terms of the relationship with other actors, I think that is that's an incredibly important role. And that is a role for member states to decide. There are areas of the SDGs where we have less of an idea of what those norms are, but there are many areas that we have a whole lot more. Secondly, the role of member states is to incentivize action. How do we agree on the right policies based on evidence to incentivize action for meeting the norms and the visions that we lay out? And then thirdly, global review and coming back and learning from one another about how we do this. So I think there is a critical role for member states in bringing together the partners, and that's very unique to member states. And then lastly, this issue of finance. We need to figure out how we finance global public goods in the right way. The Addis agenda gets us part of the way. We know that in the climate agreement, climate finance was quite controversial. We still need to figure that one out.
Thank you very much, Jimena.
Thank you. Very briefly, I think that peace, the concept of peace in the 2030 agenda is redefined because it's no longer only for post-conflict or conflict countries or areas of the world. It is really universal. It's a concept that is relevant and it matters for all our countries, and that's kind of the spirit in which we negotiated peace throughout the agenda. So when thinking of the indivisible nature of the 2030 agenda and including peace, we need to use the upcoming meetings to really think of that as a thread. We have the UN Habitat in Ecuador, and the goal on cities includes safe cities. So threading it there as well, threading the universal nature in the world drug problem, using the same approach to peace and thinking of demand and supply in a debate that has been highly securitized, such as the drug problem. So really thinking in horizontal ways will really help us move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nabarro, and then I will have a comment or two before I invite the next one.
Thank you very much indeed. Chair, so if we start by agreeing that it's a political agenda, and I don't think anybody's disagreed with that, what makes it special? Answer that world leaders have taken responsibility for some really tough issues that exist in today's world. And so the big difference here is that it's not the usual story where people say we'll do with the easy stuff and we'll put the bad stuff and the hard stuff under the carpet. And I believe that starting point of trying to do the responsible thing is a key thing we have to hold on to. Secondly, it's courageous. And so we've got world leaders taking on tough issues in a courageous way. And I would say to you that COP21 is the absolute example of that. And why am I talking like this? Because I see it as not necessary for us to say back to them, you should set priorities, because their priorities are absolute. They're about a world fit for people and a world whose resources have been regenerated so that it doesn't burn up or dry up. And because these priorities are so absolute, they're about the future of life as we know it, I don't push back and say, we need to turn this down to priorities. I say the priorities are very clear, people and planet. And so whilst I know, John, that it frustrates you, and you mentioned it to me before, as a directive for action, as a political manifesto, it's responsible and it's courageous. But then can we deliver on it? And that's then to the points that you were all focusing on about how the member states and the institutions will work together to make it happen. And I think the best term I heard just now, sir, I'd forgotten your name, but I just want to say thank you for stressing that these really tricky problems call for recognition of the interdependency of government in all its forms, civil society, business, the media, and our international system, and of course our regional institutions, which are hugely important. And that interdependency has been recognized for ages, but what we're trying to do now is to help get the greatest possible benefit from managing the interdependency in a way that leads to good results. I watched that with climate, the climate summit that took place in September 2014, and then the use of that popular pressure and engagement of multiple actors to buttress the negotiation process, which some people believe was absolutely key to getting a good outcome in Paris in December 2015, because that sense that engagement of civil society, the political energy that comes from that is key to stimulating courageous political decisions by world leaders. Even if it's wrong, it still seems to be a plausible hypothesis from which to work. And so as we move forward, recognizing that interdependence of multiple actors in dealing with really tough problems requires us then to consider what is the right architecture to make it happen. And so to last point, that's where I think you, in the comments you make and in the way you're thinking, are right in the right place of thinking how to make sure that the UN recognizes its humble role. It's a tiny creature. The PowerPoint shifting the things around, it's not even at the bottom with kind of radiations coming out of it. It's off on the side, and in many cases it's seen as irrelevant and invisible. But that in a way adds value because it should use its invisibility in many settings to become a magnetic field that catalyzes, that convenes, that encourages convergence to get to these outcomes. And one of the main ways in which we're going to have to do that is not through trying to buy the outcomes with development assistance. That's important, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The real thing is to make sure that all future private investments of any kind, anywhere in the world, are compatible with mitigation of rise in the Earth's temperature and with the realization of the goals. And we're hearing that message more and more from finance houses, people investing on long-term 30-year pension fund or sovereign wealth money. They're saying now we want to pay attention to what's in these goals so that our investments are going in the right direction, given that this is the way the political leaders want to go. And a convoluted answer or response to many questions and points. But for me, it all hangs together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think if you make an assessment that the message is actually percolating down to civil society, to investors, to the finance sector, then you have a beginning. But there are other issues still, and I hope we can pick up some of them. The issue of measurement. I had the chief statistician in India tell me, somebody who works for the chief statistician, look, this is going to be a Herculean task because how are we going to measure and what are the means available. Now, a country like India has that feeling. You can imagine what's going to happen in the others.
Terribly difficult.
Very, very difficult. So I think let's also, therefore, not just be optimistic for the sake of being optimistic. Optimism is essential, but we have to be realistic also. There was a comment on the ICM, and my only reaction quickly is that the Independent Commission is looking at the functioning of the multilateral system anchored in the UN alone. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that that's not the full multilateral system. There are parts of the multilateral system which are outside the World Trade Organization, the other Bretton Woods institution, but our remit is just limited to the UN, and therefore we are looking at it through that functional matrix of 16 areas which was on the board. Thank you very much. I'm going to now open the floor. Yes, madam. Let's start with you. Yes.
I'm Deborah Jones with Save the Children. Many thanks to IPI and ICM for hosting this important discussion. 4 quick points. I really want to underscore the message that we're hearing today of moving beyond silos and working toward interdependency. We already see UN agencies starting to work in silos, and we really need to encourage the interlinkages. Now, when I look at when I think about this, I think about a continuum and really trying to link the humanitarian agenda with the development agenda and the climate response, and that more than ever, when we look at slow onset emergencies and protracted conflicts, and those countries that are furthest behind, or were furthest behind in the MDGs, are those in conflict and fragile states. Second point, on the point of data, when we talk about leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first, and this wasn't a given at the beginning of the negotiations, so I mean, this was really a big win, I think, to have this language, but something that Save the Children has been advocating for is this idea of interim targets, and that when we're trying to reach the furthest behind first, that we need to look at a national level and a local level creatively in terms of how we're measuring reaching those. A third quick point on financing, 2 aspects. First off, we want to ensure that the UN has the funding. We want to ensure that the 5th Committee understands the importance of funding this agenda. Second point, we want to ensure that both development and humanitarian or emergency responses are given equal weight, and that we're not having development funding pulled out for humanitarian response, as we saw in the late fall. And then a final point, and something we as Save the Children have really been advocating for, is opening of space for the engagement of children, not just young people and adults, but the engagement of children in global processes, and that, I've experienced firsthand some incredibly savvy, smart, and articulate children, and even if we're looking at older children, we're really keen to see how at the national level and in global discussions space can be open for their engagement. Thank you.
I'm an organic horse-powered farmer up in Sullivan County, New York. And for the last 5 years, I've co-chaired the energy working group for the 7 counties that serve as the regional economic development councils under Governor Cuomo's new initiative to drill down and get the planning about economic development in this state down where it belongs, and that's where the people are. So the first point I would make is that I'm focusing only on the 2030 climate change paper. I would like to see there, in addition to all the wonderful things that are there, some more of the political manifesto intensity. It says there, and I disagree with it, although it hurts my heart to say so, that ending poverty is not number 1, where it says there. It is in my county. I'm the poorest county, and we're in the poorest county of all of New York State, so I really know what it's like. But I think the first one is climate change. Climate change drives absolutely everything else. It's got a time limit on it, and we can't keep up with the changing calendar. But it's getting worse, and it's getting worse and not better. The second point I would make is that I celebrate Dr. Puri's comments about data. What we know as we look at the data collection and the analytics that we do on it, we are constantly getting tired of doing the analytics because it's so ghastly. On both sides, there's so much, I'll call it criminality, there's so much injustice going on in the energy sectors and other financial sectors, and at the same time, there's fabulous, fabulous and wonderful intellectual stuff and actual stuff on the ground that's really, really quite systemic and quite huge in terms of multiple millions of dollars. So there's great opportunities there. We're going to find all along the line a whole train of benefits that are synergistically put together. So I certainly hope that when it comes to the budget, somebody looks the other way or lifts an eyebrow or maybe two eyebrows when they say, on this section here, come on, boys, data is data, and no one really cares. That's where we got to go. I think that's where one of the biggest harvests, as a farmer would say, and that's the end game. It's not what you do. You got to produce. And that data collection thing is absolutely, absolutely essential. So I want to thank the group, and I want to thank the Fletcher. I'm an alumni of Fletcher, so whoever's here from there, thanks a lot. I worked here in 1967. I've never been back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One good turn deserves another. Since you supported me on the need for data and being able to make empirically verifiable assessments, I'm going to also say that you are dot on target on this climate change urgency factor. Our paper deals with 2030 and climate change, and I think somehow the discussion has got caught in 2030 because that's something on which we have greater pride of ownership here because it was negotiated in New York amongst the 193 member states. But you're absolutely right. The climate change is not going to wait. And in the initial comments before Dr. Nabarro got here, I said what worries me about that climate change agreement in Paris is look behind that outward commitment and you go a little down, it is dependent too much on member states and their commitment to stick to what they are supposed to do, and it may unravel. But we have the vice chair of the fifth committee here, so if that venerable, important person wants to come in to comment on the comments that you made on the fifth committee, I mean, I'd be quite happy to hear you. But yes, the lady there, Annette, yeah. May not want to.
Yes, I think I would just like to let you know what other people are doing. My name is Patsy Robertson, and I chair the Ramphal Institute in London, which is an independent think tank for Commonwealth governments. I imagine everybody here knows about the Commonwealth. However, 35 of our 53 member countries are small island states, extremely vulnerable. And what we have started to do is we've identified 6 of your SDGs, and we are now working to break down all of the, I nearly said the guff around climate change, in order to give practical ideas for small countries to take action. And we are working through the Commonwealth, we'll be working with the Commonwealth Secretariat. We are part of the Policy Institute at King's College London. So if anybody wants to come and talk about what you're doing here at King's College London, let me know and I can facilitate that. But the whole point is we study a lot of the literature around these issues. We break it down into simple solutions, the things they can do. People tend to forget that small countries, they don't have the civil servants, they don't have the people to read large and complicated reports. And I'm afraid the UN does do large and complicated reports. And then we ask them, we show them our recommendations, we show them, is it possible for you to do it, and help them to carry out the agenda. We have started a debate in the Commonwealth on migration. Yeah. And I just want you to know that if there's any way we can patch into what you're doing, do let me.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate your drawing attention to the fact that the Commonwealth Secretariat has a technical assistance program for the small island developing states. In fact, they're also, the same countries are also members of the UN. And in fact, you are helping drive home the point that we it's not possible to get an overall agreement on success of the SDGs unless we are able to ensure that the transformation is there in all 193 member states, and the more vulnerable ones especially. But look, David Navarro has to leave, so I'm going to request him to spend a minute or two on giving some comments, and we can continue later for a few more minutes. You have the floor.
So, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Excellency. I wanted just to react to this issue about climate change. I think that most of us recognize that there is an extraordinary urgency to get things right on climate change, and we're at a very high risk inflection moment where an agreement was reached, but it's not yet signed. And once it's signed, it's got to be ratified. And then people have actually got to do the work to deliver on commitments. And some of those commitments are going to be tough politically to deliver on. And then we've probably got to go further and decarbonize more to really get the temperature increase below 2. I think everybody recognizes who's involved recognizes what a high risk it is. And what the Secretary General did was he said to me, take on my climate team and my 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development team and lock the two together. So it's not either or, it's both and. And that's what we're doing. And that's why for us, the signing event on the 22nd of April is absolutely key. We want as many as possible of the states parties, it'll be 197 by then, we think, to actually sign the thing on the 22nd. So if you've got any influence anywhere, it's signing that matters. And there are one or two countries who possibly standing on the edge. We're not saying bring your head of state, that would be a nice bonus. And we had a very, very important head of state commit today to come. But it's important that we get the thing signed. Then please make sure that we climatize the 2030 Agenda intensively everywhere. It's a big, hard job. That's going to be the heavy lift, the really heavy lift for the next 15 years. There's lots more. Peace will be the other big one. And I was really interested, I think, in Deborah's point, my second thing, of how important it is to incorporate the sustainable development thinking into all peace-building work. We were with the president of Somalia the other day, and it was so interesting to hear him say, we're not going to have peace, particularly in the south of our country, unless we can at the same time get the rest of the SDGs into place. And then lastly, the data problem is just massive. And that's why we've got to learn the lessons from the people who are getting really skilled at handling big data. We've got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of new big data around, and data philanthropy is a huge opportunity. Big data are a natural resource that we've got to use. And I do hope that in your report, as you take it forward, you will really stress the potential of going beyond household surveys into big data as well, because I think the work that was done by the Data Revolution Group was so important. I have to just go because there is a very, very, very relevant meeting that I've got to go to and be there by 3 o'clock.
Yeah, but before you leave, please join me in giving him a very warm expression of our appreciation. Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Yeah. You're great. You are a most fantastic leader.
No, thank you very much for bringing your leadership. The Secretary General always says thank you for your leadership, but I mean it seriously. Thank you very much.
I'm thanking him all the time. And everything I say is in the name of the Secretary General. I have no individual status. See you later.
All the best. Thank you very much. Thank you. All the best. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I fully appreciate
the party early.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm now going to request each of my panelists to wrap up in a minute and a half so that we're within the time. Would you like to start, Adam? Yeah.
Sure, I can be brief. One thing I think in the second round, everyone has picked up on this notion of interdependence. Dirk, thank you very much. I think absolutely we see that as well. We talk about the civil society as part of the third UN, so it's not an external actor. It's actually could be understood as part of the system. Interdependence is key for all of these issues, I think. Also, sub-regional organizations, as the ambassador said, it's definitely part of our understanding of regional organizations, and it's something that we think needs to be given greater attention. On that, I think also one of the lessons of the SDGs that I see in relationship to civil society, regional organizations, all these issues, is that inclusion is not just it's just a normative imperative. Inclusion is about effectiveness, and as we talked about this as a political agenda, the inclusion both in the deliberation of the agenda and in the implementation of the agenda is key to moving it forward, and I think also this language of interdependence will help there. I would also include, in reference to the representative from Save the Children, this includes youth. We had a youth retreat here at the ICM, and one of the things we learned or discussed is people often talk about the youth as the future. The youth are also the present, and they need to be their voices need to be included. Finally, quickly on the issue of finance, I think I would just say in the context of this paper, we're interested in the role of the private sector there, not just as a contributor of money, but also as a source of innovation. And I think that that also holds for addressing this question of data and measurement.
Thank you. I think I was forcefully reminded that in my hurry to wrap up, there was a request for the floor. One of you, if you wish to take it quickly for a comment or a question, we'd be happy to respond. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Puri, and thank you very much to your panelists. I just want to thank you very much for this good debate. Unfortunately, Mr. David Navarro left a little bit, but I want to thank you on behalf also. I'm part of the Fifth Committee. I'm vice chair of the Fifth Committee, and we listen very carefully to all the indications related to finance. So I think in that sense also, I just want to point out that in the Fifth Committee, we are expecting as well a very important report that is coming by the end of this week that will incorporate the different structure of how the Agenda 2030 will be implemented. And of course, that will have a discussion specifically in the context of budget and administrative issues in the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will tell David that your silence earlier should not lead to the inference being drawn that you did not want to be put on the spot. In fact, you have told us that you're looking for the report. Can I just, on behalf of everyone, say this is the time to show generosity of spirit in the Fifth Committee. So I'm sure when this comes up on 2030, Mintu, you have the floor.
Having spent a lot of time in the Fifth Committee about a decade ago, I don't envy the job that you have. So just wanted to touch on 3 points. First, on partnerships and this issue of private investments. There's clearly a lot of challenges and the need to address accountability issues and making sure that we have the right regulations in place and standards and that all actors are taking those into account. But there is a tremendous role for private investment, for the private sector to also, and partnerships to also contribute, which we've talked about. And so I just wanted to make sure that I think that is very much a part of this. And I appreciate that the report has addressed that, both in terms of meeting the climate agenda as well as the SDGs. Secondly, on measurement, it's nothing like having a local farmer to make the case on measurement and data. Really great to have you here. The UN Foundation is really proud to be the institutional host of the new Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is to try to help bring in all the actors. You just heard David talk about big data, all the actors who have expertise to bring to bear to this challenge. There are major data gaps. There are major issues that we have to address here, and that we really will need all of those experts, the data scientists, the people who know how to interpret and use big data, and harness all of that for sustainable development. They can harness it for marketing and knowing exactly how to target you on what types of things you should purchase. How do we take that technology and those insights to apply to meeting the climate and SDGs agenda? Thirdly, I want to just end on the first question that you asked, Ambassador Puri, on how the UN should adapt. And I think we've heard this loud and clear today, but I want to get a little bit more detailed on this, is this point about getting away from silos and integration. David mentioned the indivisibility of the agenda. This is not just vague platitudes. People talk about it, it just rolls off their tongue. We have to be integrated. We have to look at interlinkages, but this is absolutely critical. 3 ways I'd propose to do this. First of all is to really focus on beneficiaries and citizens. In the real world, we don't have silos. We don't arbitrarily separate peace from health, from education, from environment. They are all very much part and parcel of people's experience. So focusing on beneficiaries in the end game, what you're really trying to achieve here, and including those voices. Secondly, the UN system. David has a big job, the UN has a big job in trying to integrate while also keeping intact those strengths that he's mentioned. I think there's a couple of ways to do this. Member states themselves need to be more integrated. I'll tell you, a lot of the smaller missions here, the diplomats cover, some of the diplomats, I mean, in your report you talked about the siloing between the various bodies and committees. Some diplomats have to cover a multitude of committees. That's, and they already see the need to integrate. We need to help them do that a little bit more. Donors and how they fund the UN, absolutely a critical part of making sure that the fragmentation doesn't continue. And then lastly, I think we really need to have a strategic planning approach, and David talked about the big conversations that are happening now, about what are those longer term challenges for the UN, how do we finance those things, and how do we make sure that that the silos that we already have, and as I mentioned before, Ambassador Rosenthal has looked a lot into this, but how do we make sure that the mandates that we have that seem to reinforce integration, reinforce silos, are then integrated? And I think if you look at the SDGs themselves, David LeBlanc from DESA did a great paper on this, a networked approach to the goals. Please look it up. I'm happy to send it around, where you can see the inherent interlinkages. The brilliance in the SDGs is not that there are 17 silos, but that there are actually 17 different ways of looking at a very common global agenda. And so in that, I just want to finalize and say, I think this effort is so important. We have a big transition year this year and next year with the new Secretary General, with new governments taking power in many different places, including this host country. And we really do have an opportunity to merge those big changes that we need to take place in the UN with the climate and the SDGs agenda, and the opportunity to do that given the new leadership that's in place. So I really do applaud this effort for taking that initiative.
Thank you very much. The task at hand for us is to convert these 2 discussion papers into final recommendation papers. In other words, we will draw on the very high quality discussion and comments we've received here today and convert those. We will depend on the feedback we get on Twitter, and I would encourage those of you who've not had an opportunity to please send us your comments in writing, because anything sent over the next 2 weeks or so can be absorbed into converting this paper into a final recommendation paper. We will, at the end of the day, have 16 individual chapters on each of the 16 areas, but the main recommendations from each of these papers will also resonate in the final report. And here there are very concrete recommendations already there, like a meeting of a group of experts on Chapter 8 and how you can use it, for instance. All the other recommendations made. But thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the high-quality discussion. And no, just to point out that Jimena had told me in the interest of efficient utilization of time, she didn't want to speak. So, and I'm not being arbitrary, so don't show too much anxiety. I mean, it's a tendency you have to curb. The issue is, we need your help now. Because as I said, we have consulted the member states will come in at each stage, we have an ambassadorial board. We need to be able to ensure that we get a high quality product if we have the critical comments of civil society, academia, and all the non-state parties to it. So thank you very much, and please join me in expressing our appreciation to this excellent panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.